Today's Kate's Talk is shared by one of the youngest CEOs and CEOs of color in our industry, Detavio Samuels. There's an African proverb that Detavio often repeats: until the lion learns to tell his own story, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. It is a proverb that underscores the theme of the forum and sets the stage for this talk. As a Black media trailblazer, Samuels will share his vision on the power of authentic storytelling from those inside the culture and what it takes to bolster content that addresses important topics such as socioeconomic discrimination and identity intersectionality. Everyone, please help me welcome our Day 2 Kate's Talk, Detavio Samuels.
Thank you, Dana. What a kind and wonderful introduction. Let me tell you what an honor it is to be here with you at the Hollywood Creative Forum, joined by creators and storytellers from all across the globe. Today, I have a presentation that I've appropriately titled for you called The Lens of the Lion. While that idea might seem a bit amorphous now, let me not bury the lead. Ultimately, this is a conversation around how important it is to control our own narratives. And in doing so, it's a secret weapon to ending the war on social injustice. Let's start from the very top. So first and foremost, we are all blessed to be a part of the most powerful industry in the world. Media. You won't find another industry that is more powerful or touches more people than media. We wake up in the morning and we grab our phones. The first thing we do is we check email, text message, and social timelines. We then turn on the radio as we jump into the shower to clean ourselves. We step out of that shower, we turn on the news and watch CNN, MSNBC, or Fox to see what's going on for the day. We then go to our breakfast tables surrounded by our loved ones, and we consume newspapers, magazines, and more from our social timeline. You'd be hard pressed to find an industry that has as much impact on our people as media does. And so it should be no surprise to us that many of us spend more time consuming content than we do working to earn a paycheck. It should be no surprise to us that many of us spend more time consuming media than we do playing with our loved ones and friends. And while we can talk about the power of media, we have to understand that the power of media is really fueled by one thing, which is the work that you and I do. Media is powered by storytelling. Media is simply the pipes, but the liquid, the potency to all of it exists in the work that you and I do. You see, it's storytelling that helps us make sense of the world around us. It's stories that help us understand how our behaviors and actions might play out in the real world without having to experience those things in real life. And so you can go back to the beginning of time when cavemen sat around fires and told stories of little Deontay and little Timmy who left the camp after midnight only to never return because they were eaten by Tyrannosaurus Rex. And so from there, they learned the moral of the story to be, don't leave the camp after midnight. It's not safe with what's out there. And so media helps us understand, and story helps us understand what we value, what we believe, and what matters to us. As it relates to communities of people, the analogy that I love most is that stories are simply mirrors and windows. For the community who is the subject to the story becomes a mirror. It holds a mirror up to them and it shows them who they are. It validates their story and tells them that they're important. It paints a picture of what they can aspire to and what's possible. For those people who are not part of that community, it acts as a window into the soul of a people, a window to better understand who these people are, what they've accomplished, and what they can potentially accomplish in the future. Media simply mirrors and windows. The one thing that is so amazing about this moment that we are in is that Black people are powering the world's stories. Black culture is driving global culture. Across every facet of pop culture, whether you want to talk about fashion, sports, or music, Black people and Black creators are working constantly to reshape how the world works. So if you want to talk about music, we'll have a conversation around hip hop, how hip hop is the number one most listened to music across the globe. You want to have a conversation around television and film? Let's talk about how Black Panther broke records. Let's talk about how the US gathers around their TV to watch everything from Blackish to we spent the last month watching teams of Black men play in the NBA to compete to be world champions. And it's just not on the big screen. When we look at our small screens and we look into social media, every hashtag, every tweet, every GIF, every meme, so many of them are powered by Black people, Black culture, and Black stories. The power and influence of Black culture today is truly undeniable. Unfortunately, we have a problem. And that problem is that despite the perceived power that comes with all of this influence, and despite the perceived power that comes with the ability to create stories that travel around the globe, Black people have never been in a position to own and write and take care of their own stories. I would like to submit to you that that's a problem when we talk about today, when we talk about things like equity and justice, because at the end of the day, I simply believe that the social justice war is a war on imagery and storytelling. That the way the machine operates and works to keep a people oppressed is relatively simple. First, they come up with racist policies such as let's enslave Black people. They then follow those policies up with racist stories that validate and justify those policies. Black people are savages, Black people are animals, therefore they deserve to be enslaved. Black people are dangerous, Black people are murderers, therefore they deserve to be in jail. I would like to submit to you today that if storytelling got us into this mess, that storytelling is going to be the key to getting us out. But to understand how we got here, let's go back to the very beginning. The story of Gomez Eanes de Zerara. I'm sure I messed his name up, but what's not important today is not his name. What's important is his story and the role that he played in being the first one to create the negative narrative around Black people that now is attached to all of us across the Black diaspora. Gomez's job was to chronicle the life and times of Prince Henry and all of his conquests as he traveled across Europe and into Moorish country. What earns Gomez the title of the first racist is not because he's the first one to ever talk about capturing a people. People had always been captured after war. After war, there's relatively two outcomes. Your people either got destroyed or you were captured and taken as slaves. So that idea wasn't new. What makes it new is that he's the first one responsible for justifying the fact that enslaving Black people was missionary work. At the end of the day, it is Gomez who writes that it is a mission from God to help civilize and Christianize the African savages. And while there was no New York Times back then, let's suffice it to say that this was a New York Times bestseller. If the list existed back then, it would have been number one. And so this idea spreads like wildfire across all of Europe, where you have some of the best thinkers from Plato and Aristotle contemplating how is it that Black people are so inferior? Is it the climate and the sun that did it? Or was this preordained by God and a curse because they're descendants of the people of Ham? And from with this idea and with this understanding, it then gives Europeans not only the energy, but the right to go into Africa and colonize an entire continent. And so this story not only follows us into the colonization of Africa, but the story follows us as they ship African slaves over to the US. When the first Black people land here in 1619, our Puritan forefathers who were men of God, yes, they needed tobacco and cotton to be picked, but they also needed to do God's work, which was to civilize the uncivilized. And so you see Black people as slaves here, and it follows us into 1776, where we earn our independence. Well, everyone except Black people, because again, they are less than human. The same story and the same idea follows us into the late 1800s with the Berlin Conference that happened in 1884 and 1885, where European leaders sat in a room and divided up the entire continent of Africa amongst themselves. Not one Black person in the room because they didn't deserve to be in the room. They didn't need to be in the room because they were less than, and colonizing them was part of God's work. And so then we should not be surprised today when we see a cop murder an unarmed Black man. We must acknowledge and realize that it is all based on an irrational fear that is based on a story that started 600 years ago. Plato said it best when he says, "Those who tell the story rule society." With Black people never being in control of their own narrative, they have never gotten a chance to rule or share rulership. I think James Baldwin might say it best when he says, "I suspect that all of these stories were designed to reassure us that no crime was committed. We made a legend out of a massacre with the Native Americans. We made a legend out of a massacre with African Americans, and we continue to make a legend out of wildness today. Look no further than Black Lives Matter protests, where today we talk about them as if they are riots and looting and violent, when 99% of them have been peaceful. And yet, and still, when we watch thousands of Americans storm our Capitol and what we believe and what we have seen to be one of the biggest attacks on American democracy in the last hundreds of years, but yet and still we'll call that a peaceful protest. We'll treat it like it's a community picnic. We'll talk about people like Ashley Babbitt as if they are patriots and mothers and fantastic people. At the end of the day, we need to get control of our stories. A quick side note for those of you in the room who are looking for inspiration and trying to identify and find new stories to be told, I ask you to only look into our history, because we've never gotten the full truth. Our history has always only been told through the lens of the oppressor, and this one-sided narrative has served one purpose: to help them rule, to help them weaponize and hide the truth. And so I submit to you today that if you look into our history, we will find blockbuster stories that will not only drive box office hits, but help change and reshape how the world thinks about us. Let's tell the story of the Tulsa Massacre, how Black people, after the end of slavery, set themselves up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, built a Black Wall Street, built a community where they were self-sufficient, where they were building millionaires, where they took care of one another. And due to white rage, which was driven by a made-up story around a Black man touching a white woman in an elevator, our white brothers and sisters then came to Tulsa and burned down the city, burned down the town, and made them start over. Let's tell the story of Lanier, Georgia, which was a very similar story, except once they destroyed the town, they dumped a lake on it so that nobody would ever know that it existed. We have to tell the stories about how we've gone from tragedy to triumph. But we should also tell the stories that celebrate the amazing impact that we've had on the world. Let's tell the story of Louisa Harris, the first and only woman to be drafted into the NBA and actually play. Let's tell the story of Mary Jane Richards, a free Black woman who infiltrated the Confederacy as a servant so that she could be close to the Confederate leaders and spread that information back to the Union so that they could always be 10 steps ahead. In our history are blockbusters. In our history is power. And it's not just about telling stories that took place on US soil. You have to understand that a global problem deserves a global solution. If the ideas that Zurara created 600 years ago apply to everyone in Africa, then we have to understand that in order to combat them, we must tell all of our stories, from the US to the West Indies to the UK to Africa. And so we have to tell the story of people like Mansa Musa, who was the richest man to ever live. Most people don't know that it was an African that did that. We should tell the story of Atlantis, which many people believe to be the story of Ethiopia. We only didn't call it Ethiopia because the European settlers thought it too beautiful to attach to that continent. Let's tell the story of the Zulu tribe and the Maasai tribe. Let's tell the story of the Haitian slaves who rejected the French, beat them at war, sent them back to France, which then enabled the Louisiana Purchase because the French weren't coming back. Let's tell those parts of our story. Embedded in our story is blockbusters, but embedded in our stories are amazing stories of tragedy to triumph and amazing stories of heroism that we've never, ever been able to tell. And while many today talk about representation, what I want you to see is representation is absolutely critical, and representation absolutely matters. Again, media is but a window and a mirror to the world. But that said, representation is simply a symptom of the bigger issue. At the end of the day, we've been represented in their stories. We were just represented as mammies, as people who were shucking and driving, as drug dealers, gang members, pimps. We've been represented. And so we can no longer settle for just being a character in a story. We need to be funding, controlling, writing, and overseeing all of our narratives. At the end of the day, we have to win the narrative war. It is true that we have gotten policy wins. We abolished slavery back in the 1800s. They rewrote the rules as the Black Codes. We destroyed the Black Codes and they rewrote them as Jim Crow. We beat Jim Crow and they rewrote that as the war on drugs. The pattern is clear. They create a racist policy, then they create stories that justify it. If we are going to win this war, we have to win the narrative war. It is not until you win the narrative war that you get the opportunity to truly erase and change policy for good for the future. Winning this war is the key to changing the way that Black people and Black culture are perceived, respected, and valued globally. At the end of the day, it's this simple. Absolutely nothing changes until the narrative change. Transformative change starts with being in a position to tell our own stories and control our own narrative. That means ownership. That means green light power. That means the ability to control and dictate budgets. That is the secret and the key to changing the story across the African diaspora. And Revolt, where I am, is 100% committed to that mission. As we close out today, I'd like to connect the idea back to the title at the beginning. We talked about the lens of the lion. And to get there, you have to understand what has become one of my favorite African proverbs ever. And it simply goes like this. Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. It doesn't matter how powerful the lion is. It doesn't matter how strong the lion is. If the lion is not telling its own story, it will always be put in a position where it is seen and told to be less than it truly is. Our simple idea at Revolt, my simple idea for you today, is that we need to put the pen back in the hands of the lion. We need to allow the lion to control its own narrative. We need to allow the lion to be its own truth teller. We need to allow the lion to tell its own story. In doing so, I fundamentally believe that we can change things for Black people across the diaspora. And because Black people are driving so much of global culture, if you change things for Black people, you change things for the world. Thank you. All right, Dana. Whew, that was a lot. Kicking it back to you.
Thank you so very much, Detavio. And yes, that proverb is actually one of my favorites as well. And it's so in keeping with this year's theme, Stories of the Diaspora, and the importance that we share all of those stories, the many layers and intricacies for everyone.
We all have a story to tell. Beautiful, complex, fascinating stories. Told through a lens of varying shades and experiences. That's the power of art imitating life. It cannot be defined or confined to one space. So let your creativity soar. Fill the page, press record, and dare to captivate the masses with your authentic voice. We all have a story to tell. What's yours?